We're going to start again. Hey. Incredible. So we've got our next keynote speaker now, Seán. So Seán is a human rights defender, and he's facing imprisonment in Greece at the moment for what Amnesty has called the criminalization of saving lives. So really excited to hear from him.
Is this okay? Yeah, cool. Hi, I'm Seán, Seán Binder. I grew up in Ireland. I'm German Vietnamese, and I'd like to talk to you about my experience in the so-called migrant crisis. And I want to focus specifically on the North Aegean, and we'll get into why in a moment. So since 2014, I want to give you some background. Since 2014, we have seen over 2 million people arriving in Europe to seek asylum. About half of those came through Greece, and half of those came through the North Aegean. And this is why I want to focus on there. When I mean the North Aegean, I mean mostly the island of Lesbos, as I'm sure you're all well aware, is one of the primary entry points, and then Chios, which is an island to the south of it. Okay, the asylum process. This is going to be a fairly boring presentation, guys. I'm going to warn you now. To seek asylum in Europe, you need to do a number of things. The first one, and I guess the most difficult one, is you need to be in the territory to seek asylum. We don't have visas available. You need to be in Europe to claim asylum in Europe. And so that's why people cross in, and why people stay on these islands, or in Greece, or in Italy, or these border countries, is because of the Dublin III regulation. So not only do you have to make it in, you're often not allowed to leave again. The countries at the border where you're first registered, if you're an asylum seeker, are the ones who are responsible for you. And so we see this kind of bottleneck in these environments. I want to just point out Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt as well. We talk about a... Sorry, I don't know. That makes sense. We talk about a European migrant crisis, but in these countries alone, there's been 5.5 million people displaced, actually more than that since. And so it's a bit of a misnomer, and the migrant crisis in general is a poor wording, but I'm going to use the phrase anyway because people are familiar with it. You're right. So Lesbos, as I said, is one of the primary entry points because of its proximity to a third country. Because it's so close to Turkey, it makes it a natural place to try and come across. And we'll get into why the sea border is one of the primary ways of doing that rather than the land border, although of course we also see land-based crossings. The blue arrows indicate some of the primary entry points. The lower blue one is where I operated, but really across this entire northeastern facing part is where people cross through. Okay, what does that look like? As I said, they must make that journey first. It's a relatively short journey. It's a couple of nautical miles, but it's not safe. And this is because, as we'll get into, this is primarily a smuggle journey. It's a journey that is effectively illegal, and it's a journey that is therefore incredibly dangerous. People are leaving in the dead of night, and they're leaving under smuggled conditions, and smugglers don't necessarily care too much about the safety on boats, as I have seen. This is a picture that we took. It is a dinghy that's designed safely for maybe 20 people, and they often have many more in them. The little mark you see in the back there, for example, is someone who's fallen off the boat. In this instance, they were wearing life jackets. That's not always the case. The blue zone, or the SAR zone, which is a search and rescue zone, is the area in which that we were allowed to operate. And it's the area that once you've crossed into, you can now seek asylum, and then you're afforded the opportunity to be granted, or at least apply for international protection. So what are the elements that operate in this environment? First and foremostly, I think the Turkish Coast Guard is who asylum seekers will interact with. So since the EU-Turkey deal of March 2016, we have effectively designated Turkey a safe third country. That means we won't violate the principle of non-refoulement by sending people back to it. The Turkish Coast Guard only operate within this territory, the Turkish territory. What they effectively do under the EU-Turkey deal is intercept boats and bring them back. We have a similar agreement with Libya, which is much worse, although of a similar kind. Frontex is the other operator, and that happens on the blue side. And it is effectively the European Border Control Agency. Its primary mandate is not to help save lives at sea, it is to disrupt smuggling networks. And this is really important because the framing is very different. If you view something as a humanitarian crisis, then you necessarily see people as drowning and you want to help them. If you see this as something illegal, like smuggling, then you're concerned not with helping people, but with criminalizing people, and this is the core difference. And Frontex and the Turkish Coast Guard necessarily operate in tandem, and indeed also with the Libyan Coast Guard in the Southern Med. And these are what I would define as the EU mechanisms. This is the way the European Union deals with this problem, and that is a buffer zone. That is to create a shield, effectively. A shield against whom? A shield against people who are fleeing war and persecution, people who should be assisted. And again, we are securing our border against these people, against folks who are seeking asylum. And the effect of this, of course, is to try and minimize the amount of people who can seek asylum in Europe. We are obsessed with making sure that as few people as possible make it across this, and at great cost, not to ourselves, but to the people making this journey in the first place. There are other actors. I would arguably, the Hellenic Coast Guard or the Greek Coast Guard are part of Frontex, but I think it's worthwhile just to mention them outside of the Frontex category because they conduct, and they certainly conducted, the majority of the search and rescue operations. And then you have civilian search and rescue, and this can be fisher people, this can be NGOs, shipping, this is also a busy shipping lane, as well as just your average individual civilians who come across these kinds of tragedies or potential tragedies and think, I'm going to help out. Okay, so when I first became familiar with the migrant crisis on Lesbos, it was in 2017 and 18. At the time, what happened was as soon as you've come into the territory, you seek asylum, and then you're processed in reception and identification centers. You're all, I'm sure, familiar with Moria refugee camp. It was a hotspot that was designed safely for about 2,000 people, but was packed at its peak with 20,000 people, and certainly when I was there, 6,500 people. The conditions in these camps were such that they actually exacerbated the kinds of problems which people were trying to evade or to leave behind. In my time there, the sanitation was horrendous. It was hundreds of people towards for a toilet and for a shower, and you can imagine the kind of medical catastrophes that can arise as we've experienced, as we also had a medical clinic in Moria. We also once saw a woman who was returned to her. These are folks who are left in little camping tents, that there's no real structural accommodation available for the vast majority of people, returned to our camping tent after having given birth the night earlier. We've had a number of people who have frozen to death simply because of exposure. You fast forward to the end of last year, Moria, which had at the time 20,000 people, burned to the ground completely. You also have no more civilian search and rescue operating on this island. There's been this, what I'm trying to really drive at here is that at the outset of the crisis, we've immediately taken the approach that people are to be stopped making this journey. And over time, that has become worse and worse to the point that today, the systems we have in place are completely and utterly inadequate. And why is this happening? Why is there no more search and rescue happening? Why have we changed the narrative from one that is humanitarian to one that views this as smuggling or illegal? Well, I think one of the main reasons, and having interviewed a couple of search and rescuers that stopped their services, is because it's a chill factor in place. They're afraid to continue operating because they're afraid that they will be criminalized. So I joined civilian search and rescue. I joined a Greek organization. It was important, I think, to join Greek efforts because this is predominantly experienced by Greek lesbians, and they felt disempowered over time. And what I'll be hinting at while I'm speaking to you is that there's been a narrative change, and that there's been a narrative change that is necessarily inherently racist, but also comes from a place of frustration and vulnerability as well. So it's important to keep in mind the agency of Greek people. We assisted more than 50,000 people. This figure is more or less bullshit. NGOs have a tendency to frame themselves as being this massively important entity, and you'll often find these pictures of people holding babies like in the water up like this, and it makes for great fundraising, but it's, first of all, completely unsafe way to hold a human being in that context. But it also misrepresents what people are actually doing. The vast majority of the time, I did nothing, like honestly nothing. We might stand there and help people by providing them with some water or a smile or a blanket. I'm not diminishing that. In the context where we secure our border and we effectively say, we don't care about your life, that is meaningful. But it also, we must remember that people are tenacious and they survive not because we help them to do so, but because they are doing so. That said, there are occasions where people are at risk of drowning, and unfortunately it happens all too much. Just the other day, 7 people drowned between these 2 blue points where we used to operate. Or was it the Northern Shore? Anyway, 7 people drowned the other day on Lesbos, and 22,000 people have died in the Mediterranean. It's one of the deadliest seas in the world. It's a picture of us training. Okay, and I guess getting to the why I'm speaking with you, or why I'm afforded this platform in the first place. I joined the search and rescue team. We went out to sea. We had a land-based approach. We also had a medical clinic in the refugee camp of Moria. And we worked shoulder to shoulder with the authorities. In hindsight, with some irony, of course, because in February of 2018, I was arrested. The police arrived at our search and rescue point, and they searched our car around 2 a.m. in the morning. And they said that we were doing something suspicious. We don't exactly know how, because we had been there every single day for 2 years, at least the organization had been. And I'd been standing shoulder to shoulder with the people who were arresting us, had helped them. And we were taken in for questioning, and then held for about 2 days in a prison cell, Sarah Mardini and I. In the interim, we were taken under armed guard to our warehouses, and they were searched. They were looking for something. They couldn't find anything. They went to my home. They even needlessly went through like bags of baking flour to search for drugs. They cast the net out so broadly to find something incriminating, but found nothing. We were released pending further investigation and continued to work on the island for months. At this point, I was coordinating the civilian rescue on the southern part of the island entirely, till eventually in August, Sarah Mardini was going back to Berlin to continue her studies, and she was arrested by plainclothes police officers as she was boarding the plane, and they said, "We want to ask you some more questions, but don't worry, you'll be on the next flight home." I received a call that morning. I was on the way to the clinic, and they said, "Seán, we want to ask you some more questions as well." I arrived at the police station, and they handcuffed Sarah and I together, and they brought us to the courthouse. And they pressed a number of severe charges. And we spent 106 days in pretrial detention and continue to face 20 or 25 years imprisonment. You're probably wondering, well, what did you do? Is it something at all interesting? And of course, foremostly, it is that I'm accused of smuggling. I'm accused of providing immediate assistance to people entering the country illegally. Also being part of a criminal organization, which is the NGO I worked for, or I volunteered for. Money laundering, my childhood dream, espionage also, fraud and forgery, among a number of other charges. If we're found guilty, our sentence will span into the coming centuries, and we'll spend 20 years in prison. I want to kind of point out the narrative that had formed. The day after our arrest, we were going to Mytilene, which is a local town. And 2 old men were driving by on mopeds, and I happened to be the Greek speaker at the time, and they just were shouting at each other while they were driving along, and she picked up words, and it was, what about that German spy who was caught in a stolen Jeep trying to infiltrate a military base to steal state secrets? They had taken this narrative from a local right-wing media post that had been leaked by the police to the press. And this narrative really mushroomed, and it's something that I think we see everywhere today. So this is an American outlet that said, its headline was, Greece, humanitarian aid organization profited by €500 million per year for smuggling people into the country illegally. This was the narrative that was beginning to form around us. So is it any of it true? And of course, while I was in prison, I pored over the documents, but we also shared the case file with human rights organizations and literally anybody who was willing to look at it. And Human Rights Watch wrote a report in 2018 which basically said that the prosecution is trying to criminalize saving lives and that the narrative being formed was not consistent with the facts being presented. One of the main issues, for example, is that the police report openly admits that the people we were helping are asylum seekers who are exempt from making illegal journeys. So how can their entrance be illegal? It cannot be. They say I'm a spy, that I'm committing espionage, which conjures these images of high-tech equipment. They say I'm a spy for two reasons. On the one hand, they say I was listening to encrypted communications. On the second, that I was using encrypted communications. The first one, what they're referring to, is the fact that I could hear the chatter between the Coast Guard and the Navy. Now, any of you who've ever been on a boat will know that maritime radios exist and you need to use them. And it so happens that the Navy and the Coast Guard communicate on an open channel, channel 16, which is the emergency response channel, the channel where you would communicate SOS, exactly the kind of channel that a search and rescue organization would be listening to. Number two, we're using encrypted communications. What they mean here is WhatsApp. So all of you, congratulations, are also spies. And money laundering, because we were raising money and therefore we must also be committing a crime. But it isn't just Human Rights Watch, for example. This is just a small list of the many organizations that have looked over our case file who have said there is nothing here at all that amounts to a crime. And I think this gets me to the most important point. There is nothing special about what I did. As I told you, the vast majority of the time, I did nothing. That means that it's relevant to all of us. If I can be criminalized, then you can be criminalized. And that's the scary thing. Many people are being criminalized, and this map just shows some of the research that is up to 2019 of at least 180 individuals being criminalized in at least 13 member states across the European Union. I remember I received an email from a German-speaking pastor who is himself being criminalized because he let asylum seekers sleep on his church pews during a storm. That was considered illegal. My point here, the point I'm trying to drive home, is that these are not happening in isolation. This is happening across the European Union, and it is part of the initial policy that I was describing to you, which is the policy and the view that the migration crisis is a matter of illegal activity rather than a matter of humanitarianism. Why are we criminalizing humanitarianism, you might be asking yourself? When I was in pretrial detention, I asked for a lot of the kind of research that's happening at the moment. And one report was written by Frontex, again, which is that body of the European Union that oversees the external border. And they published a risk analysis paper in 2017 that basically said this, and it's a really intuitive argument. And it goes, even if NGOs don't explicitly try to or do in fact help smugglers, the fact that they're in the water makes it that much easier for smugglers to sell their wares to the people who are willing to buy tickets on these boats and make these incredibly dangerous journeys. And in so doing, even if not directly illegal themselves, are facilitating illegal activity. When I read this, I thought, oh fuck, how naive am I being that I think I can help somebody, but actually make this journey so much more dangerous and also, of course, exacerbate a for-profit system that, from my point of view, is dangerous and preys on vulnerable, the most vulnerable, in fact. What it says, in essence, is that we should stop search and rescue. The truth, of course, is that the pull factor is completely unsupported by any available data, completely. There's neither a positive nor negative correlation between the amount of search and rescue in a part of the water and the amount of people passing through that part of the water. There just isn't a correlation. I always try to, and this doesn't project particularly well, but there are references up there. I'm happy to share them with you if you don't want to take my word for it. But far more mundane things, and it's so obvious, are going to determine whether somebody will climb into these boats. And it is, what's the weather like? What way is the tide going? What's the wind like? What are the push factors? What kind of coercive forces are at play here? There is just no correlation between search and rescue and the amount of smuggling happening through it. We do, of course, know that it does offer a safety factor of some sort. And that is, the more people that are doing search and rescue, the fewer people will drown in that part of the water. Which puts into sharp relief the kinds of practices that I've been talking about, which is the criminalization of search and rescue that we see across the European Union. What I've tried to set up so far is that there's a, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, can I just ask a really quick question?
Sure.
Just when search and rescue is happening,
Mm-hmm.
if you go because you find some people, in the water, can you go either way, or would you always go back to Greece?
So we operate exclusively on the European side. Yeah, and this is primarily to avoid the risk of being told that you're pulling people across that border. This is the difference, effectively. If you're not crossing that border, then you're not exacerbating it. No, it's not absolutely necessary, because of course you have a right to help, and there have been arguments put into place, well, we can't return people to Turkey because they will claim that returning them to Turkey is dangerous and that they are at risk, and so you need to take them to a safe port. Arguably, Mytilene would have been that safe port. But in general, our operations were exclusively within European waters, and so the closest port was, of course, Mytilene. But that's a good question. It's more relevant in the high seas, so in the Mediterranean. And of course, what you see, and I'm getting a little bit off piste here, but effectively what you see over time is that the Libyan SAR zone, the search and rescue zone, expands while the European one contracts, and the European NGOs are expected to follow that expansion or that decline and to take people accordingly to the closest port, which could be, for example, in Tripoli, which of course they wouldn't do, because of course it's dangerous, because of course there's research coming out of there that the kinds of rape and torture, of enslavement, of coercion are not environments that you should be returning people to.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. Yeah, so what I wanted to point out now, or really drive home, is that there's a difference between a securitized response and a humanitarian response to this crisis. And what I've tried to argue is that the European Union adopts a securitized one, while perhaps NGOs adopt a more appropriate and humanitarian response. Securitization effectively views as, again, I'm recapping, smugglers, traffickers, and fake refugees as the primary agents. And so security policies effectively try to create more difficult and deadly conditions, because in that way it'll stop smuggling from happening. Now, that is, of course, perverse, and it cannot be accepted. And I'll get into a reason why internally this logic is also wrong. But it's led to relationships like the EU-Libya agreement that I hinted at when I was talking about the EU-Turkey deal of March 2016. What I want to do now is just really highlight the difference between a securitized response and a humanitarian response by reading you this brief bit of research, which you can also find, and it's by Forensic Architecture. It's called the Left to Die boat. You may be familiar with it. While I'm reading you this, I want you to keep in your mind that there is an obligation under every inch of every international maritime convention, whether it's salvage or solace, that a boat in distress needs to be assisted if you're able to do so, which search and rescue boats, of course, are, which military boats, of course, are. So keep that in your mind. So a vessel left Tripoli at around 1 a.m. on the 27th of March in 2011. Now this, of course, is before the so-called migration crisis. But the point here is, and as we'll get onto, this is a securitized space with 72 migrants on board. And at the time, NATO was enforcing an arms embargo in the Central Med. So it is the most surveilled section of the sea in the entire world. Again, securitized. This is in a securitized ocean. At 3 o'clock on the same day, the boat was spotted by a French aircraft that transmitted its coordinates to the MRCC, the Coordination Center in Rome. So now we have the first interaction. We should be hurtling towards this boat to assist people who might be in distress. And I think under most leveled or right-minded conversation, a boat like a dinghy that are crammed with full of people on the high seas, oftentimes with zero experience in seafaring, is a boat in distress, almost by definition. One interaction. After 15 to 18 hours, the migrants place a distress call on their satellite phone. Second interaction. So now we should definitely be heading towards this boat. We know exactly where it is. The vessel's GPS location was determined a couple of hours after that. And shortly thereafter, the MRCC in Rome signaled the boat's distress position to all vessels in the area. It's arguably a third interaction now. Every single boat in the Mediterranean is aware of these 72 migrants in this tiny rib, and they know they need help because they placed a distress call. Still no help rendered. And it also alerted the MRCC in Malta and the NATO headquarters. Again, NATO is the military alliance. In Naples, the vessel is flown over by a helicopter, 4 interactions, no assistance given. The satellite phone now falls into the water shortly after this, so now they lose their ability to contact, but they've already made 4 contact points. The vessel is approached by several fishing boats, 5 interactions. Requests, screams for help are unheeded. A military helicopter now flies over and drops a pack of biscuits over the side. That's 6 interactions, no help rendered. The following morning, now they're in Maltese search and rescue zone. Now they've made it. Now they've arrived. They run out of fuel and they drift for 7 to 8 days before they're encountered by another military ship. 7 interactions, no assistance rendered. They drift until March 10th. They left on the 27th. They drift until April 10th. They left on March 27th. They drift all the way back to Tripoli. And upon landing, of the 72 asylum seekers, 11 are still alive, and 2 die shortly after that. That is how the European Union secures its border, and it is the exact opposite of a humanitarian response to this crisis. Okay, if you're with me and you agree that perhaps humanitarian action isn't the pull factor that we're told it is, then what is causing this journey, this illegal journey from the logic of the securitization policy? Why are people leaving? Well, the obvious one is that there's push factors. People are leaving persecution and war and environmental catastrophe and all other kinds of reasons to get into these horrendously dangerous boats and undertake these horrendously dangerous transitions. But in many ways, securitization is itself the pull factor. And this is why. If it's illegal to be in Europe without the necessary documentation, which it is, we all have the correct documents to be here right now. If it is impossible to receive international protection without crossing the border into the host territory, as at the outset I suggested or I said, is the fact, the reality in Europe. And if we secure our border, as I've just tried to highlight we do, then people are forced to undertake smuggled journeys. There's no other way of receiving international protection. Securitization policy creates the need for smuggling. It doesn't overcome or alleviate smuggling. Bit depressing, really. So I want to end on a what can be done note. If you accept the logic that the European Union has, and to an extent that the UK has, or exactly that the UK also has, and you want to stop smuggling, then you need to revise your policies because they're not working. They're internally incoherent. And they, of course, also do not satisfy any of the obligations that member states have towards people in distress. Oftentimes, I think what happens is that humanitarian NGOs are framed or pitted against the official response. And I would temper that assertion slightly by noting that, well, in the ideal world, no one would be drowning. There would be no need for any search and rescue because no one is getting into dangerous situations. In a better world, the authorities would be doing this job because they would view this as the humanitarian crisis it is, and they'd be offering support because they are best placed to do so. They have the resources, they have the ships to do so. In the world that we actually live in, they don't do that. And there's a gap in service. And this is a gap that needs to be filled unless people fall through it and drown. This is why search and rescue exists. It's not to supplant or to exclude, it is to fill a gap. And I'm not just saying that in a metaphorical way, I mean that really literally. There was a British border force vessel on Lesbos while I was there. It's called the Valiant. I got an email from their medic once that said, we've run out of supplies. We don't have the supplies we need. Can you give us your supplies? This was specifically emergency blankets. They didn't have any left. That's the reality. The other reality is that the Greek Coast Guard doesn't do regular first aid training. They just don't do it. We happen to be able to teach them to do so. This is what I mean. They lean heavily on, or they require, NGO work. The other thing, of course, is to talk about this, is to raise awareness about this in an advocacy context, to talk about it at the European Union level. I know I'm now speaking to a largely British audience, but I don't think it's that different. We have a similar thing happening here with regards to the Borders Bill. And speaking about that, we're not asking for anything more than what the European Union and its members have already said that they would do. I'm not exactly a radical person asking for these far-flung ideas. I'm simply saying that you respect the laws that you yourself created or have signed up to, whether it's the UDHR, the ECHR, the maritime conventions that we're all parties to. I think also, I'm kind of spitballing here a little bit now, but I think this is often a very polarizing conversation, or it is in fact a polarizing conversation, which is understandable. But we end up, I think, picking or adopting sides that, well, I fall into my echo chamber all too quickly. But it also means that I enter into the debates about what is best policy from a very adversarial point of view. And what I've noticed by speaking with folks, my neighbors, for example, who have said, Seán, what you did, like I can see where you're coming from, but it's naive and it's illegal and you shouldn't have done it. Immediately saying you're racist, or when they say you should let them drown, for example, which is something else that I've heard, has not been the most useful way of engaging this conversation. What I think is important is that, and this has been very difficult for me, is rapport building. And I found it a really strange experience to try and figure out a line of conversation that allows us to understand that it doesn't matter if you're on the right or the left of the political spectrum. When you strip away all the rhetoric, what we're talking about here is that people shouldn't be drowning. And that's it. And I think if we can get to that point and speak about that core value, we'd be far better served in our aims. That's it. Oh, just a quick aside. I try not to use any pictures of individuals that I don't know, particularly not pictures of asylum seekers. I know that's what the organizers also prefer, and I think that's really important because what we don't often realize, and I kind of hinted at this earlier when I was talking about the pictures of babies being held upright, is that, you know, that those families that are arriving, not only do they have a right not to be exposed in that way, but they might also be in danger if they are being photographed. So I try to always only use maps because it helps contextualize a little bit what's going on. And then I was thinking, how can I end on a positive note? And so I asked my mother, what do you think? What can I do? And she said, why not the globe? Because we're all one community. Very beautiful. And then do like live, love, laugh as a banner. And I thought, absolutely no way. Thanks, Mom. You might now be wondering, okay, well, where is your case at? And if you're not wondering, I'm going to tell you anyway. Yeah. Which is that we went to trial on the 18th of November for the misdemeanors. We've been waiting years and years for this trial to happen. And in fact, we've been pushing desperately for it because we know that what we did isn't illegal. And I think also the prosecution knows that, and that's why it's taking so long. because it's quite debilitating, of course, from a financial point of view and from and any kind of point of view, really. And we went to trial in November, and it was such a poorly written indictment. The document that called us to trial was missing a page. We weren't named, we were numbered. It was 24 defendants, 1 through 24. People faced slightly different charges, so you didn't know who you were in the indictment, so you couldn't prepare your defense. And for a number of other reasons, we had to postpone. It was adjourned, and we're waiting again for the next trial date. But we're expecting to hear back in the next couple of days that we will be formally charged with a number of other felonies. These are the more serious crimes. And the campaign that we have set up to talk about this is Free Humanitarians. And if you're interested in learning more about it, then feel free to scan that QR code. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. Cool. Does anybody have any questions about this depressing topic? Yes, go for it.
So when you have the map of all the different instances of criminalisation and solidarity across Europe for different people,
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if different countries have had different responses, or depending where the sentence the person's being charged is from, where the crime was committed, and if some European states are shutting these kind of cases down, or if they're all being carried by the state against the individual who is acting in solidarity and humanitarian.
Yeah. So certainly we see this across the European Union. It's not a particular government in power at the time. It's happening across the Union, and I think it links back to when I left prison. I was asked to help conduct some research with Rizoma, which is a platform on migration, asylum, and integration. And its core question was, can it be linked to European Union legislation? And there is something called the Facilitation Directive or Package of 2002. And that basically outlines what is facilitation, smuggling, and trafficking. And there is an exemption clause in Article 2, I think. It basically says something along the lines of, if you're a bona fide humanitarian actor or a family or a religious institution, I think, then you are exempt from the kinds of prosecution that are in the rest of this in this law. So there is in place an exemption, and various member states have actually ratified this exact exemption. Greece is one of them. Greece is one of the main countries that are prosecuting, and what they simply do is they argue, well, yeah, they're not bona fide, though, are they? Because they are smugglers. And that's really the tool that they use. So we see it across the Union, to answer your question. The kind of second thing I'd want to point out here is that, what I've discussed, and it's really further evidence of the platform that I have, the vast majority of people who are being criminalized for this are people who are taking this journey themselves. And they are not given a platform. And they're not given legal advice. And they're not giving anything, really. And that is really the crux of the issue. The vast majority of people in prisons, as I have met, are folks who are told, you are the smuggler because you happened to be next to the engine when we intercepted this boat. And they receive very little support, and they're not represented in the kind of data here. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Can I ask, I don't know if this is maybe too personal, but I can't understand the mentality of like a military helicopter that goes and drops biscuits in the
You and me both.
I can't understand it, and I feel like I will probably in the sector still, and I can't understand anyone's mentality. I think it's actually a massive Achilles heel. Do you understand? I don't understand. Can you help me? Please can you repeat that for the web streamers?
Sure, yeah. I think that the question was, how is it an understandable approach or assistance to help people who are in distress by dropping, for example, a pack of biscuits over the side of a helicopter?
Yeah, how can you be so apathetic or indifferent?
And how can you be so apathetic or indifferent? Okay, yeah. Sorry, I was just repeating. I wasn't talking over you. I don't know. I honestly don't know. I don't understand how that is appropriate. Exactly the reason I talk about it is because I don't think it's appropriate. And it doesn't at all, from my point of view, resonate with the obligations that the government is under, or that military force is under to help people in distress. And obviously, patently, throwing a pack of biscuits over the side of a helicopter does not help anybody in any material way. The point is, I think, is that we have arrived in a situation in which we have viewed this crisis through a frame of illegality. And so these are not people necessarily deserving of anything. These are illegal people making a journey across who have no right to be here because they're being smuggled and they want to work for profit, or whatever the lens is, it is a lens that seems to have dehumanized people to the extent that they are not entitled to the support that they obviously are. And this is, I guess, and I'm not sure I'm answering your question anymore, what I meant about finding or framing the conversation in a better way. What I've noticed is that when I say to people, it's so obviously racist, what you're saying. And I'm having this conversation at the moment a lot with people about Ukraine, for example, because the European Union has wonderfully absorbed, about 1 million people from the Ukraine, given Russian war in that territory. Wonderful, great. But why is our cultural frame that extends the former Soviet Union not also extended to people who are not in Europe? Why is that difficult? Why is their experience different to the Ukrainians or to our own? How can't we extend that? And I think that by pointing out that those might be racist, or they might be somewhere, the position that folks have might be somewhere on they're not racist, but they're anti-racist maybe. I'm not sure how to best explain that difference, but certainly pointing out that somebody might be racist or that this has a racial element, I have found it has quickly been shut down. So I tend to adopt a conversation around values a little bit more, or shared past. So I grew up in Ireland, and I once had this conversation. If I'm going way over time, please tell me. Okay. And if it's interesting, just tell me it isn't. Okay. I grew up in Ireland, and there's a neighbor of mine, we were having a barbecue, and he says, yeah, but Seán, people in Calais, I've seen them myself, they all have mobile phones. Like, these are wealthy people, they don't need asylum. First of all, you can be wealthy and need asylum, and people have mobile phones, and it makes no difference. And he goes, yeah, but a lot of them are also criminals, and they steal, and they're just bad people, and they're not. And the point, I think, to me to push back on is, it doesn't really matter who you are. You don't deserve to drown. You deserve to be helped as a human right. And then I pointed out, Ireland has such it's actually a really shared experience of migration, and to some extent forced migration, given the famine of 1851 in Ireland. People left for economic reasons, but also because if they wouldn't have left, they would have died, which many people did. And so they went to the United States. And I said, this is part of a shared experience that we could actually be realizing and working towards common ground here. And he said, yeah, but that's different because the Irish were law-abiding. They're really great. And I said, are you referring to the fact that the police force is largely Irish in Boston and in New York? He said, exactly. Ireland is different from the migrant coming from the MENA because the MENA's migrants are criminals and they steal things, whereas we are the police force. And I said, did you realize, of course not accepting what he meant at all about folks in the MENA to begin with, but did you realize that the people in Ireland who migrated were so impoverished that they joined these social clubs, and these social clubs, again, anthropology, really boring, I accept that. They joined these social clubs who worked for small-time politicians in these cities, and as the politicians rose up their ranks, they did so by racketeering, and they used these social clubs as their gangsters. And as they grew higher up in the political hierarchy, they just institutionalized the thugs that they had, the Irish people they had who migrated over, into the police force. It actually is a deep culture of criminality. What I've now done, which is really inappropriate, I don't mean to do, is to indicate that actually it's okay to be criminal because we're all criminals. Not my point. My point here is that there is a shared experience of migration and a complexity that we can talk about without necessarily saying you're a racist, and in a way that we can build up some kind of shared experience. And I think that if all we're doing is having this polarized conversation that these are criminals or these are everyone's a vulnerable, deserving asylum seeker, you miss the opportunity to have a more meaningful discussion. And I think that's partly how you end up with policies where you're throwing biscuits over the side of a boat. Maybe. Yeah.
I think we are at time now.
Sorry.
But thank you so much, Sean. That was incredible.